And then soon, this century. And then I think we'll see Japan coming back on the stage, because there's a huge amount of talent and amazing things going on there, but there are some structural issues which are preventing it from being more successful than it has been in the past few years. South Korea is a very up-and-coming economy, actually, as well. Maybe sort of in contrast to Japan. And they've achieved that through, firstly, protecting national industries, national chaebol as a conglomerate, so especially LG and Samsung. A huge amount of government protection enabled them to grow very well in the domestic situation. They then turned their interests to international branding and expanding themselves overseas and becoming very successful, again, with a lot of government support. So it's actually hard, it's very hard for, say, German companies, for example, or American companies to compete with LG and Samsung, even in international markets, let alone in Korea, because of the amount of support that they get back home from the government. Okay, moving on quickly to Southeast Asia. Well, one part of Southeast Asia, so Southwest Southeast Asia, if that's possible. I mentioned Indonesia earlier, big country, 240 million. Yeah, Singapore is kind of like the Hong Kong of Southeast Asia, very small, 5 million, but again, very successful, high GDP, 50,000 USD per capita. The government may not like to admit it, but that is actually not equally distributed within Singapore. Increasing wealth gap, surprisingly, despite the fact that the government treats all members of the population or all citizens equally in some respects. It's not the case for wealth, as far as wealth is concerned. Essentially, it's built as a trading hub originally. A lot of the imports are actually huge, but a lot of that is re-exported with further processing going on in Singapore. The government is trying to develop some national industries. So we have electronics, we have chemical processing and petrochem. That's a huge part of the business, the government's business. We have a very big container port. So it's kind of swapping places every year with Hong Kong in terms of who's the biggest container port in the world, or Rotterdam, of course, as well, but it depends how you measure it. And then more recently, they've been struggling. They were actually caught, Singapore was caught off guard a little bit by China, the rise of China in the early part of this decade. And they've been trying to address that by really promoting and establishing specific industry hubs in Singapore. So healthcare is one of them. Chemical processing is another. They've been recently trying to promote the idea of Singapore as a financial center with some success. They haven't yet realized, well, they probably have realized, but they haven't yet done it. They need to let go of the protection on the local banks first before the foreign banks will really see Singapore as a financial hub that competes or could compete with places like Hong Kong and Frankfurt. But hopefully that will happen as the eyes open. The other side of Southeast Asia, so Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, Laos. Laos takes a bit of a backseat. Places like Laos, Cambodia, not really up and coming yet, but Thailand, Philippines, quite well established economies, pretty big. Philippines nudging 100 million. I guess not a lot of people know that. It's grown hugely and very, very rapidly in recent years. The population is also extremely young in the Philippines. I think it has the youngest age profile of all Asian countries, actually. And I believe China or Japan probably has the oldest profile, but they're very different. So this, 15 years ago, this was 60 million. It's grown 50% in 15 years. It's really quite astonishing. That obviously brings a lot of problems because of the pace of growth, the amount of money available and so on. Social problems as well. But it also is indicative of a future opportunity in terms of market size and economics and business. Where else? Vietnam as well. One of the fastest growing, actually. We did a little survey among our clients about 18 months ago, and Vietnam came out as the #1 country that they're looking at, apart from China, in terms of business opportunities. So this is quite interesting. They suffered during the global recession, sadly, but I think the fundamentals are there. It's a big country. The economy is reasonably widespread, so we have quite a big industrial sector. It's no longer dependent on rice farming, for example, too much. A lot of industries being developed there. And the government is making a big effort to enable foreign investment to come in more easily. So really reducing the bureaucracy that used to exist, making it such that companies are dealing only with 2 or 3 sets of regulations instead of 10 or 12 sets of regulations when they're trying to get into the country. And very, actually quite a vibrant and positive-minded citizenry as well. Okay, moving on in the interest of time, I maybe just touch, obviously, in South Asia, quite a few countries, but India is the big one. 1.2 billion, pretty low GDP per capita, behind China. A lot of multinational companies tend to sort of think of China and India together. We've done quite a few studies in the past few years for, especially sort of for CEOs who have a very top-down view, thinking, I've got to get into China or India because those are the countries which are, everyone's talking about. But actually, when you look at it, they're totally different beasts, although they're both very large countries. India's economy is really, it's much less widely based than China's. It's dependent on some very specific things, especially service sector, the fact that they have an English-speaking population, the outsourcing business process, BPO, business process outsourcing, that kind of thing, is huge. Domestic consumption is picking up, but there's still a massive rural sector, and there's a lot of logistical and infrastructure issues. It's a democracy, unlike China, so that in some ways holds it back and makes it more difficult for business to develop because every state has its own government and there are different regulations, and you can do one thing in one state, you can't do it in another state, so on and so on. So yeah, very interesting place. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to talk about it. Very briefly on Australia and New Zealand, this is kind of exemplifying the diversity yet again, because Australia is really like a Western economy. It's much more like the US than anywhere else in Asia. And it's had a very, very long successful economic growth track record recently, which has been great until the recession hit, unfortunately. Okay, just briefly on a couple of the kind of issues that we come up against when we're looking for information and market intelligence in Asia. On information sources, so official information, obviously in the West we rely on this a lot. It varies hugely in Asia from country to country. In some countries there's a lot of it about, like in China there's a lot of it about, but the question is how reliable is it, and do you want to rely on it? Press in Asia is kind of not very well developed compared to the West in many countries. In some it is. Thailand is an example where it's better developed. Singapore is an example where it's developed, but it's extremely closely controlled by the government. So you don't necessarily find the kind of information in the news that you would find in Western countries. There are industry associations for many industries. In a lot of cases, they are simply there for their members to know each other or for other reasons. They're not there to gather information and publish information on the industry in a lot of cases. And if you're not a member, you will find it very difficult to get anything out of these guys in many countries. Off-the-shelf studies, because of the nature of the information industry starting out in places like Europe, Finland in our case, North America and so on. A lot of the companies who are publishing market reports, industry reports, they are in Asia. It's improving, but the level of quality and detail that is available is really not up to the standard that we have in the West. Yeah, and corruption, as we talked about a little bit for China, but this is, again, pretty prevalent in a lot of countries. In Thailand, they call it tea money. It's just a normal part of doing business. In Indonesia, it's an extremely normal part of doing business. And I think in Indonesia is probably the place where it's as open as I've ever seen it. People will literally say, yeah, I can do that for you, but it will cost X rupiah, when in fact it should be free, and everybody knows it should be free, but it's just like a sort of open corruption, essentially. Quite strange, but that's the way it is. Okay. So, yeah, just to wrap up, if you, as I've said, we do recommend always that you do your research know what you're getting into and find out specifically what are the opportunities and threats and risks for your own specific company in your industry in the exact countries that you're going to be targeting. The way to do that is to really go local. You need to understand what's happening. It's such a diverse region. You can't take a broad brush approach and say, okay, I'm just going to go into Southeast Asia. It really has to be, are we talking Singapore? Are we talking Malaysia? Which bit of Malaysia? Who are the partners? So on and so on. Verify and validate the information. So don't rely on one source. Try and get things from at least 2 different sources and really get the detail on what you're getting yourself into. Exhibitions are great, are very good, if there is one which is covering the exact area that you're looking for. I mean, obviously you need to make sure that it's very targeted on what you want, because the nature of exhibitions is their business is getting as many people in as possible. So they often kind of exaggerate a little bit what their coverage is, and they may list the cargo services as one sector that they're involved in. When you get there, you find it's like one corner with only 3 companies or something like that. So I think exhibitions are good if there's one that's very relevant to what you're doing, but make sure you check it out properly first. Otherwise, you need to go to the country, find an agent or somebody trustworthy who can help you find some potential partners and go and meet them. See them eye to eye, sit down with them, share some food, drinks. In Asia, I think one very, very good way of building trust as a newcomer is just share a meal or some, it sounds kind of weird, but it's food is a kind of a very binding element in a lot of Asian cultures. So go down and meet some people and have lunch with them, would be my advice. Which of Asian countries are investing overseas into Europe or Americas? Yeah, well, Korea is a big one. Obviously, Japan's a big one, but they've been doing that for some time. Southeast Asia. It's actually a very interesting question, because the Southeast Asia and South Korea actually started out in very similar situations in the sort of 1950s or so. Korea has become extremely successful. Southeast Asia, because of the political situation in many countries, they have not been able to build big brands and highly successful companies which are able to operate outside their own borders. So in fact, there are very, very few Southeast Asian born companies which are investing overseas into Europe or Americas. You find a few like Singtel, for example. That's probably the biggest example, the Singapore telecom company. They've been buying up, especially in Asia, but also in Europe. You might find, Indian companies. Yeah, sure. There's some very big groups in India, especially some privately held groups who are investing in their specific area. I mean, Tata and those kind of guys, obviously. Yeah, but Southeast Asia, not so much.